Late 1941, Zbigniew, occupied Poland. Dr. Stanisław Matulewicz stood in the small laboratory he'd built in a shed behind his cottage, staring at a blood sample through his microscope with growing excitement that bordered on disbelief. What he was seeing shouldn't have been possible, according to everything he understood about diagnostic medicine. But the test results were unmistakable, unambiguous, and if he was interpreting them correctly, potentially revolutionary in ways that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with survival. The Weil-Felix test he'd just performed showed a strong positive reaction for epidemic typhus, the deadly disease that killed millions during World War I, and remained one of the most feared infections in wartime Europe. The problem was that the blood sample came from a young Polish man who'd visited Matulewicz's clinic earlier that day, a man who showed absolutely no symptoms of typhus, no fever, no rash, no confusion, no physical distress whatsoever. This should have been impossible because the Weil-Felix test was considered highly reliable for diagnosing typhus infections. Yet, here was a perfectly healthy person, testing positive for a disease he clearly didn't have. Matulewicz knew immediately what had happened and what it meant, and he knew he needed to contact his friend from medical school, Dr. Eugeniusz Łazowski, who was practicing medicine in Wrocław, 6 miles away, because what Matulewicz had just discovered could save thousands of Polish lives if they had the courage to use it. The discovery had happened almost by accident. The young man had come to Matulewicz asking for help, avoiding forced labor conscription to Germany. Nazi occupation authorities were systematically rounding up Polish men to work in German factories, sending them as slave labor to replace German workers who'd been drafted into the Wehrmacht. Those selected for forced labor faced brutal conditions, minimal food, dangerous work environments, and often died from exhaustion, malnutrition, or industrial accidents. The young man, desperate to avoid this fate, had proposed an extreme solution. Could Dr. Matulewicz amputate his arm? If he was missing a limb, surely the Germans wouldn't take him for factory work. Matulewicz had refused, appalled by the suggestion, but the encounter made him think about medical ways to disqualify people from labor conscription. German authorities required medical examinations before transport to Germany, checking for contagious diseases that might spread in factory dormitories and workshops. Typhus was at the top of that list because it had devastated armies during World War I, killing more soldiers than combat in some campaigns, and Germans remained terrified of epidemic typhus even 25 years later. Matulewicz had been working with diagnostic testing equipment because German occupation had disrupted normal medical supply lines. Instead of sending blood samples to laboratories in distant cities like Tarnobrzeg or Lublin and waiting 6 to 10 days for results, he'd taught himself to perform basic tests in his improvised backyard laboratory. Among these was the Weil-Felix test for typhus, developed in 1916 by Austrian bacteriologists Edmund Weil and Arthur Felix during World War I, when typhus was devastating the Austrian army. The test exploited a curious fact of immunology, that antibodies produced by the body in response to rickettsial bacteria causing typhus would cross-react with certain strains of Proteus bacteria, particularly Proteus vulgaris, OX19. The mechanism worked because Proteus OX19 and typhus rickettsia shared similar surface antigens, molecular structures that triggered the same immune response. In practical terms, this meant you could diagnose typhus by mixing a patient's blood serum with killed Proteus OX19 bacteria. If the patient had typhus antibodies, the serum would clump or agglutinate when mixed with the Proteus suspension. No clumping meant no typhus. Strong clumping meant active typhus infection. What Matulewicz discovered, quite by chance, when the desperate young man's case made him think creatively about the problem, was that the causal relationship could be reversed. Instead of testing for typhus by looking for antibodies that reacted with Proteus, you could create false typhus antibodies by injecting Proteus. Matulewicz had taken killed Proteus OX19 bacteria, the harmless suspension used in diagnostic testing, and injected it into the young man's arm. The Proteus bacteria were dead, unable to cause infection, but they still contained the surface antigens that triggered immune response. The young man's body, detecting foreign antigens, produced antibodies. And those antibodies, when tested using the standard Weil-Felix test, reacted exactly as if the man had typhus. The blood sample clumped. The test showed positive. But the man had no disease, no infection, no symptoms. He just had antibodies that made German doctors think he had typhus. Matulewicz immediately saw the implications and understood he needed to discuss this with someone he could trust completely. He traveled to Łazowski to visit Dr. Eugeniusz Łazowski, his friend and classmate from Józef Piłsudski University in Warsaw, where they'd both studied medicine before the war. Łazowski had survived extraordinary hardships since Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. He'd been serving as a second lieutenant in the Polish army when war came, working on a Red Cross medical train. He'd been captured by Soviets after their invasion of eastern Poland in September 1939, placed in a prisoner of war camp destined for Siberia, and had escaped during transport by jumping from the train in darkness and making his way through occupied Poland back to his family. Later, he'd been captured by Germans, held in a POW camp, and escaped again. By late 1941, he was practicing medicine in Łazowski with his wife Mirka and young daughter Ewa, living under Nazi occupation, treating Polish patients, and secretly providing medical care to Jewish families despite German prohibitions that made such care punishable by death. When Matulewicz explained his discovery, showing Łazowski the test results and describing how he'd created false positives by injecting dead Proteus bacteria, Łazowski understood immediately. They sat in Matulewicz's cottage, speaking quietly, windows covered, discussing what they could do with this discovery. The ethical question was straightforward. They were doctors sworn to heal. But in occupied Poland, where Germans were killing and enslaving their countrymen, deception in service of saving lives seemed not just justified, but morally necessary. The practical question was more complex. Could they actually fool German medical authorities into believing a fake typhus epidemic was occurring? Would German doctors test blood samples themselves, or rely on test results from Polish physicians? How many false positives would be needed to convince Germans that an epidemic was spreading? What would Germans do if they detected typhus in Polish towns, and could the consequences be controlled? They decided to try. The German response to typhus was predictable, based on their obsessive fear of the disease. When Germans detected typhus, they quarantined entire areas, declared them Fleck fever zones, using the German term for epidemic typhus, and refused to enter quarantined regions except when absolutely necessary. German military personnel, occupation administrators, and civilian settlers would evacuate from infected areas. Most importantly, for Polish survival, Germans would halt all deportations from quarantined zones because they didn't want to import typhus into Germany or spread it to concentration camps. A fake typhus epidemic could theoretically protect entire communities from forced labor conscription, from resettlement, from arrest and deportation to camps, creating a medical shield behind which Polish populations could survive. The two doctors began their deception carefully. They selected patients who faced imminent danger, young men on lists for forced labor conscription, families scheduled for resettlement, people whose connections to the Polish resistance made them vulnerable to arrest. Łazowski and Matulewicz would inject these patients with killed Proteus OX19, wait for antibodies to develop, then perform viral Felix tests that inevitably showed positive results. They documented these cases carefully, filed reports with German occupation authorities as required, and sent blood samples to German laboratories in larger cities for confirmation. The critical element of their deception was that German doctors, terrified of contracting typhus themselves, never examined the supposedly infected Polish patients directly. They relied entirely on test results. And the viral Felix test, considered the gold standard for typhus diagnosis in the 1940s medicine, showed exactly what Łazowski and Matulewicz wanted it to show. The German response was exactly what the doctors had predicted. As reports of typhus cases accumulated in and around WWII and Zbigniew, German authorities declared a quarantine zone. Signs went up, warning of fleck fever. German personnel evacuated. The flow of forced labor conscriptions stopped because Germans wouldn't transport potentially infected workers to German factories. Resettlement operations ceased because Germans wouldn't relocate populations that might spread disease. Even Gestapo operations were curtailed because German security police didn't want to risk infection by entering quarantine villages. The fake epidemic was working, creating exactly the protective barrier the doctors had hoped for. What had begun as an attempt to save individual patients was expanding into protection for entire communities, encompassing roughly a dozen villages and approximately 8,000 people. Łazowski and Matulewicz maintained absolute secrecy about what they were doing. They didn't tell their patients they were being injected with harmless bacteria, rather than actually contracting typhus. They didn't tell patients' families. They told no one outside their immediate conspiracy of two, because any leak could result in execution. The punishment for deceiving German occupation authorities was death, usually by hanging or shooting, often with reprisals against family members. Both doctors understood they were risking everything, their own lives, their families' lives, for a deception that had to remain perfect, because even one discovered fake case would bring catastrophic German retaliation. Łazowski later wrote in his memoir that he carried a cyanide pill with him constantly, ready to take his own life if capture seemed imminent, rather than face Gestapo interrogation that might expose the entire scheme and doom the thousands of people they were protecting. The deception required constant improvisation and careful management of German suspicions. German authorities, while terrified of typhus, weren't completely stupid. They noticed eventually that mortality rates in the supposed epidemic zone were remarkably low. Real typhus outbreaks killed between 10 and 40% of those infected. Yet deaths in the Rozwadów-Zbigniew area remained at normal levels. This discrepancy could have exposed the fraud, but Łazowski was prepared with explanations. He falsified medical reports showing higher consumption of medications used to treat typhus symptoms. He documented complications and recoveries. He selected actual deaths from other causes and attributed them to typhus when filing reports to German authorities. The paperwork created an illusion of a real epidemic, with normal patterns of mortality and morbidity that satisfied German bureaucratic scrutiny without requiring German doctors to actually visit the epidemic zone and examine patients. By late 1943, German authorities had become suspicious enough to send an inspection team, a German military doctor accompanied by 2 medical assistants, to verify whether the typhus epidemic was genuine. This was the moment when the entire deception could collapse, when direct examination of supposedly infected patients by German physicians would reveal that nobody actually had typhus. Łazowski learned about the inspection team's planned arrival, understood that his scheme was about to be exposed, and desperately tried to find a solution. The answer came from the Polish underground resistance network operating in the area. When the German inspection team arrived in Rozwadów, they were met by Polish officials who explained that yes, typhus patients could be examined, but first perhaps the German doctors would appreciate some refreshment after their journey. The refreshment was vodka, generous amounts of vodka, administered over several hours until the senior German physician was thoroughly drunk. When he finally agreed to visit a patient, the Polish guides deliberately took him to a home where someone actually was sick with fever, not from typhus, but from influenza. The examination was brief and conducted by the doctor's 2 medical assistants, while the doctor himself remained outside, still drinking, still avoiding direct contact with supposedly infected patients. The inspection team filed a report confirming the epidemic was real, and German authorities continued the quarantine, never realizing they'd been fooled by drunk doctors examining real sick people who didn't have the disease they were supposedly infected with. The fake epidemic continued through 1943 and into 1944, protecting the Rozwadów-Zbigniew region from the worst of German occupation policies. While other parts of Poland saw massive deportations to forced labor, mass arrests by the Gestapo, and the final liquidation of Jewish ghettos with inhabitants sent to death camps, the quarantine zone remained relatively protected. The Germans were too afraid of typhus to risk operations in the infected area, except when absolutely necessary. This didn't mean the zone was safe or that people didn't die. German occupation was brutal everywhere. But the fake epidemic reduced the frequency of German incursions and created space for resistance activities, for hiding Jews, for maintaining some semblance of Polish community life under impossible conditions. Łazowski's involvement in resistance activities extended beyond the fake epidemic. He was a member of the Narodowa Organizacja Wojskowa, national military organization, later integrated into the Armia Krajowa, Home Army, the main Polish resistance movement. He treated wounded resistance fighters, provided medical care to underground operatives, helped hide people hunted by the Gestapo, and used his position as a doctor to move through occupied territory with less suspicion than most Poles faced. The fake typhus epidemic complemented these resistance activities by creating a zone where German surveillance was reduced and resistance operations could function with slightly less risk. In July 1944, as Soviet forces approached from the east and German occupation was collapsing, Łazowski received warning that Rudolf Zimmermann, the Gestapo chief in Stalowa Wola, had ordered his arrest and execution for treating resistance fighters. Łazowski fled Rozwadów with his family, making his way to Warsaw and eventually surviving the final year of war in various locations before returning after German surrender. The true story of the fake typhus epidemic remained largely unknown for decades after the war. Łazowski and Matulewicz never spoke publicly about what they'd done, partly because they'd operated in secrecy for so long that staying silent became habit, partly because in post-war communist Poland there was little interest in celebrating heroes who'd worked outside official party narratives. Matulewicz left Poland after the war, eventually settling in Zaire, where he became a respected radiologist and died far from the country he'd helped save. Łazowski remained in Poland initially, continuing his medical career, working in pediatrics at medical institutions in Warsaw, but eventually emigrated to the United States in 1958 as a Rockefeller Foundation Fellow. He settled in Eugene, Oregon, continuing to practice medicine and raise his family in America. It wasn't until the 1990s that Łazowski finally wrote his memoir, Prywatna wojna, wspomnienia lekarza żołnierza, 1933 do 1944. Private War, Memoirs of a Doctor Soldier, 1933 to 1944. Published in Polish in 1993, and later translated into English by his daughter, Alexandra Gerard. The memoir detailed the typhus deception for the first time publicly, explaining how he and Matulewicz had used the vial Felix test's limitation to fool German authorities into believing a fake epidemic was real. The story gained international attention, with journalists calling Łazowski the Polish Schindler for saving thousands from Nazi persecution through clever deception rather than direct confrontation. Łazowski's approach was different, using medical deception to protect entire communities rather than individual rescue operations. But the fundamental courage of risking death to save others was identical. The number of people saved by the fake epidemic has been estimated at approximately 8,000, based on population data from the dozen or so villages included in the quarantine zone and the duration of protection the epidemic provided. However, detailed documentation of exact numbers is impossible because Łazowski and Matulewicz deliberately avoided creating records that might expose their deception. They kept no lists of who they'd injected, no accounts of fake cases, no documentation that could fall into German hands. What survived are approximations based on regional population statistics and Łazowski's memoir, descriptions of the scope of operations. Some accounts have claimed that 8,000 Jews specifically were saved by the typhus deception, but this appears to be an exaggeration that Łazowski's own memoir contradicts. The area around Rozwadów had substantial Jewish populations before the war, but by 1941 to 1943, when the fake epidemic was operating, most Jews had already been forced into ghettos or killed. The fake epidemic protected primarily Polish Christians from forced labor and deportation, though Łazowski did save individual Jewish lives through other means, including providing prohibited medical care to Jewish families and helping hide Jews from German authorities. The scientific mechanism behind the deception was elegant in its simplicity and completely consistent with medical knowledge of the 1940s. The Weil-Felix test, while considered reliable for diagnosing typhus, was actually a crude agglutination test that detected antibodies based on cross-reactivity between rickettsial typhus bacteria and harmless Proteus bacteria. Modern medicine has largely abandoned the Weil-Felix test in favor of more specific diagnostic methods, including immunofluorescence assays that can distinguish between different antibody types and confirm whether antibodies result from actual infection or from exposure to cross-reactive antigens. But in the 1940s, the Weil-Felix test was standard practice, and German doctors trusted its results completely. Łazowski and Matulewicz exploited this trust, understanding that the test's limitation, its inability to distinguish between antibodies from actual typhus infection and antibodies from Proteus exposure, was a vulnerability they could weaponize to protect their community. In 2000, Łazowski returned to Wrocław for the first time since fleeing in 1944, visiting with American documentary filmmaker Ryan Banks, who was producing a film about the typhus deception. The visit was emotional and bittersweet. Many of the people Łazowski had saved were dead from age. The communist period had transformed Poland in ways that made it feel foreign to someone who'd lived in America for 4 decades. But in Wrocław and Zbigniew, Łazowski was remembered and honored. The communities he and Matulewicz had protected understood that they owed their survival to 2 doctors who'd risked everything to fool the Germans with fake disease. In 2016, memorial plaques were unveiled in Wrocław commemorating both doctors and their role in saving thousands through medical deception. The story of Eugeniusz Łazowski and Stanisław Matulewicz demonstrates several profound truths about resistance and survival under totalitarian occupation. First, effective resistance sometimes requires deception rather than direct confrontation. Armed resistance was heroic, but often suicidal, against a militarily superior occupier. Medical deception, exploiting German phobias about disease, achieved protection without violence. Second, professional expertise can be weaponized for good. Łazowski and Matulewicz used their medical knowledge not to heal disease, but to fake disease, turning diagnostic limitations into strategic advantages. Third, sustained deception requires extraordinary courage because discovery meant death, and every day the scheme continued was another day risking exposure. Fourth, individual initiative matters even in massive conflicts. 2 doctors working in small villages saved 8,000 people through creativity and courage, proving that ordinary people facing evil can make extraordinary differences if they're willing to risk everything. Eugeniusz Łazowski died on December 16, 2006, in Eugene, Oregon, at age 93, having lived long enough to see his story become known internationally and to receive recognition for courage that had remained secret for 5 decades. Stanisław Matulewicz, whose initial discovery of the Proteus injection technique made the entire deception possible, died in Zaire, far from Poland, but remembered by those who knew what he'd accomplished. Together, these 2 doctors proved that medicine could be more than healing. It could be weapon, shield, and salvation. That a fake epidemic could save more lives than any real treatment. And that sometimes the most effective resistance to evil comes not from armies, but from creative individuals willing to risk everything to protect their neighbors from tyranny. The fake typhus epidemic that fooled the Nazis and saved 8,000 Polish lives stands as testament to human ingenuity in the face of inhuman oppression and to the power of medical knowledge deployed not for its intended purpose, but for the higher purpose of protecting the innocent from those who would destroy them.